Morning, everybody. Welcome back to the third of 3 adult forums with Jennings Mergenthal. It's been such a delight to have him here for the sustained time. One of the things that we heard from feedback from, I think, years prior is that for adult forums, some of you had said, you know, it's hard for us if we just do these one-off things, you know, because you have a session and then you're on to some other different topic. So Mary and Carolina and I and Caitlin worked on the idea of doing these series, you know, just like we've done. So I hope you've gotten as much as I have, because, you know, you can't, I said in my sermon last Sunday, we'd need a whole year of these, Jennings, to even try to do justice to what you're giving to us. So thank you for at least doing these 3. So please welcome Jennings back for the 3rd session.
All right, so the 3rd presentation, as you can see from the title slide.
Oh, I think I need to turn it on.
I think that would be great. Oh, there it is. Ah, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about the wilderness. This is the first Google image result for when I searched wilderness, and it serves the purposes nicely. I'm going to have some of you shout out what you see or what you think of when you think of wilderness. Trees. There's lots of trees in this picture. Pardon? Yes. Crucial to the existence of wilderness is it not having people in it. I was going to build up to that, but since you beat me to it, okay, let's just... So this gets at the myth of the ecological Indian. Many of you may recognize the Crying Indian pollution advertisement from the Keep America Beautiful campaign. Iron Eyes Cody was in fact Italian. He lived much of his adult life, both on and off screen, continuing his performance as an indigenous person. And the impact that this ad had on tying pollution about making pollution into an individual problem, as in it's the fault of the people themselves and not the places that make the packaging, as well as its combination of the stereotypical idea that Indians all lived in harmony with nature and are now extinct, with him walking through the polluted landscape, really just sort of ties together a whole bunch of things that we've covered in the course of this presentation, or this series of presentations. So I tried to make an animation, but it didn't work. So this is the US, you may be familiar. When settlers arrived, they primarily arrived to the East Coast. Settlement proceeded more slowly, but there was obviously contact further out. When you have a settlement here, you have trappers and fur traders and people maintaining trade networks out here. And when settlers went out there, they brought with them all of their diseases. There's a whole series, again, it would take a whole year to talk about the various controversies about disease spreading and why it happened, and whether it, as John Winthrop said, was divinely ordained, or whether it was simply the fact that European settlers were filthy and had lived with a lot of domesticated animals and also did not like to bathe, and that tends to breed disease. But anyway, going back to this one, so trade and quote-unquote exploration preceded settlement, and this meant that disease preceded settlement, which meant that the America that settlers expanded westward into was not one that was not, the America that they expanded into was not the same state that it always had been before. They proceeded to expand into what was effectively a vastly depopulated wasteland because a number of the people who lived there had been killed by disease. This is notable especially in New England, when throughout the course of John Winthrop's life and writing, the native population of New England declined by 95%. over the course of about 50 years, in part because of disease, in part because of campaigns of war, and in part because of just the British campaign of taking nations and moving them to the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations as enslaved people. So that meant that the wildlife, the ecology of what the settlers expanded into, that they saw as pristine and untouched, was in fact the consequences of here is where people have lived, here is where people have been killed, there is now a lot more empty space that nature can expand into. A perfect example of this is the passenger pigeons. We are all probably familiar with the images from the 18th century of like flocks of billions of birds blocking out the sky. And this got talked up a lot as this is just a feature of the American wilderness. It is so vast and empty that there can be these massive flocks of birds. But the passenger pigeon population itself was a symptom of the waves of disease and displacement that preceded colonization. Passenger pigeons nested here. So in the grand scheme of things, the earlier area that got disrupted by disease, they were known to range as far out as here. But the primary food of passenger pigeons was mast, so nuts from various nut trees. There were a lot of them in America before various tree blights and diseases. And nut trees were intentionally cultivated by indigenous people through agroforestry practices. When you want access to nuts which are high in fat and high in protein, so you cultivate the trees. Then when 95% of the people who live near and cultivate those trees are wiped out, there are suddenly a lot of nuts. And that suddenly enables a much larger passenger pigeon population. Historically, the passenger pigeon population remained relatively small because of the limited availability of food. It's a highly fluctuating population. When there was more food, they would have more chicks, and then the population would grow, and then as they exceeded the amount of food available, it would descend again. But the absence of indigenous people to harvest the nuts that they had cultivated effectively led to an exponential population growth in passenger pigeons, which was then seen by settlers who arrived as, this must be a natural feature of the lands we are going in because this is a land of bounty and excess. It's so empty that of course there can be all of these animals. Completely ignoring the ways that the landscape was intentionally shaped and cultivated by indigenous people, and the disruptions to this intentional shaping and cultivation. I'm going to go back to the map again. As settlement itself expanded into the Old Northwest, the passenger pigeon population was not able to replace all of the birds that it lost to hunting. And they were a cheap and abundant source of protein, so of course they were hunted truly to excess. And they also nested in huge mast sites of like millions of birds. And when the forests in the Old Northwest that housed these nesting sites were cut down for hardwood, it meant that the large nesting sites could no longer be supported, which means that the passenger pigeon population could no longer be supported, which is why effectively in about 30 to 40 years, the passenger pigeon population dropped off so profoundly. And even though the late 1800s and early 1900s were the beginning of the early conservation movement, which we will talk about in a little bit, the population decline was too precipitous for anyone to do anything about. By the time they noticed, it was effectively too late. And this is one of many stories of sort of population disruption because of colonization. Now we're going to talk about the term ecocide, which is defined as the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Such things as persistent deforestation or intentional efforts to make a particular species extinct. Unrelated, we're now going to talk about bison. So there were a lot of bison on the plains. And bison were another species where in the absence, well, absence is a very passive term, in the forced absence of indigenous people to maintain populations, they did see a population increase as disease preceded colonization, particularly after the plains smallpox epidemic of 1837, which began in the North Dakota Territory and eventually rippled outwards to as far as California and Alaska, and effectively devastated a number of the indigenous populations there. But there were a lot of bison. And bison were the primary, the fundamental to the diet and lifestyle of a lot of plains nations. There were also in this image quite a disruption to the railroad because they're very large, and as easy it is to drive a train through things, it is harder to drive a train through a bison. And this is a man standing atop a pile of bison skulls, because in the 1800s, there was a concerted effort by the US government to eradicate the bison, because as you can see at the top, a sergeant at the time said to a hunter, kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. The presence of the bison allowed indigenous people autonomy in both culture, lifestyle, and most importantly, food. And the campaign by the US to eradicate the bison was because it afforded them that agency. By killing the bison, they could effectively force dependence on the US government and on farming. I believe it's a Philip Sheridan quote where he says, "We could not control the Indians until we had destroyed their source of meat." What's my next slide? Oh, that's jumping ahead. And so the intentional ecocide, if you will, of the bison was a highly intentional a way of destroying indigenous culture and agency as well, in addition to making space on the prairies, which would then become farmland for cattle instead of bison. Now we're going to talk about national parks. This is a Thomas Hill painting of Yosemite Valley in 1885. This gets back to our idea of wilderness, because wilderness, as created by the colonial consciousness, inherently means without people. You have people in a town or a city, and you have wilderness. You can't have people in the wilderness because then it's not wild. There's some inherent property to nature. And this is the mentality that presided as settlers expanded westward. This was a wilderness. Of course there weren't people living here, except of course there were people living there. And there were people who intentionally cultivated and shaped the environment in ways that allowed settlement to be possible. So the Yosemite Valley painting here is actually, I misled you a bit. I cropped off the bottom of the painting. And I also cropped off the first part of the title, which is Indians in Yosemite Valley. Here are the Indians. They have a campfire. Thomas Hill worked for John Muir in the nascent national park system and was sent to a lot of the beautiful vistas to make paintings and to document the pristineness of nature. But he documented what was there, which was at the time indigenous people. Again, there's a far longer history of indigenous people and national parks. but effectively and in short, the purpose of national parks and state parks to a degree was to preserve wilderness for the people of the city, for the civilized people to go and enjoy, because being in the wilderness builds vigor or something, whatever Teddy Roosevelt said. And this inherently meant forcibly depopulating the national parks. There is a high correlation between land that was part of a reservation and land that got made into a national park. Because once the treaty era had finished in the 1870s, there wasn't, you couldn't have a state legally dispossess indigenous people from land that had been promised to them, but the federal government could do it through things like the creation of, say, Chippewa National Forest. And once these were created as national parks, they needed to be maintained as wilderness spaces, which meant that the people living inside of it had to be forced out. So Yosemite was the first national park. I looked up the date a couple times, but I keep forgetting it. But it followed directly in the genocide of California natives after the gold rush. And in the sort of rush to seize the land available, the federal government decided to take this particular land and make it a national park, preserving it for posterity and also making sure that Indians couldn't live there. This makes it especially fitting, the framing of national parks as America's best idea, because in a sense, it is the best and most American idea. It was a way to sell people on indigenous dispossession and make it look natural, make it look inevitable, and make it look like something that's good for the whole of society and should be uncritically celebrated. So thanks, Ken Burns. Oh, I did put the date on there. Yellowstone was the first national park in 1872, and then Yosemite was about 15 years later, was incorporated as a national park. So now let's talk about preservationism. The presiding mentality in the cultivation and the maintaining of national parkland for most of the 20th century was it needs to be preserved. It needs to be kept in its natural and pristine state, and we can't allow things like forest fires to disrupt it. Hence Smokey Bear. We are now, today, and in the past 10, 15 years, reaping the consequences of a century of fire suppression, which is this. Because the mentality of preserving national parks in their pristine form meant taking a very European approach to fire suppression. European forests in Europe don't usually burn. It's not a feature of them. A forest fire in, like the Black Forest in Germany, is not a natural part, is not a part of the ecosystem that maintains it in a particular way. This is not true in the American West because, I don't know if you know, but the climate of Europe is not the climate of the entire world, as much as many try to make it that way. In a more arid and a more rainy season, dry season, West, periodic burns are necessary to, in order for a lot of species to go to seed, and also to prevent things like this from happening. If you have small periodic burns that destroy that burn the deadfall and the smaller plants, you won't have them build up, and you won't have them build up to fuel massive fires that are particularly being driven by climate change. And just very recently, there have been reconsiderations of, especially in California, of indigenous forestry practices, of people going back and looking at colonial accounts and of Spanish explorers, noting that the landscape of California and much of the forests of the West was dominated by smoke because they were doing periodic burns, because it's much easier to do a periodic burn than to have the entire West Coast be on fire. And this is this is another example of the sort of introducing of a mentality to and trying to apply it to everywhere, as well as one of the many ways that the removal of Indigenous agency in maintaining land has been harmful. Because if you have periodic burns, like we've been over, you don't have things like this happening. There was not a way to make this into a natural thing, but now we're gonna talk about usufructuary rights. Usufructuary rights, I could not find a good graphic, so I found this graphic of the apple tree, which takes a very literal definition of the word from the Latin usus, meaning to use, and fructus, meaning fruit, literally the right to use the fruit. Usufructuary rights are often included in treaty rights where you, as an indigenous nation, would lose the ownership of the land that you've ceded, but you would maintain the usufructuary rights, so you would maintain the right to hunt and fish on the land that you have ceded. This was, again, an intentional, harkening back to last session, this was not a good faith gift or negotiation on the part of the US government, because from the beginning, part of their plan was we are going to put Indians on reservations and then we are going to forcibly destroy their culture through boarding schools. If you no longer maintain traditional hunting and fishing practices because your children have been educated in a boarding school, this right, even though you have it, is effectively null. The hope was that they would use this right for perhaps a generation or two before being completely assimilated. And that obviously didn't work. And now the government is having to grapple with things like how to preserve usufructuary rights when, from the beginning, they were never meant to last to the present day. They were meant to be a placeholder to placate a generation or two who would then, with their culture, die out. And usufructuary rights come into, in a lot of treaties, are written out as the right to continue to hunt and fish and gather in land that you've ceded. And this is one of the larger argument points in the fight against Line 3 because of the inherent and inevitable ability of pipelines to leak. It already has, and they just finished it, and it leaked a whole bunch this summer. And using usufructuary rights as a way to say that this land has to be maintained because we still maintain the right to hunt and fish and gather wild rice on it. But in part because usufructuary rights were never meant to be maintained, the government does not really have systems in place to govern their maintenance. So particularly in the case of Line 3, the way they dealt with this is they didn't. They simply ignored it because that is what they do. That is the pendulum of US Indian law. Things get bad and things get less bad. People listen to the arbitrary rules they made for you and then they decide to ignore the arbitrary rules. This is the pendulum swing the other direction from the Bolt decision in the 90s, which guaranteed the rights of the Salish people to catch a certain percentage of the salmon catch in the Pacific Northwest. That was then a right that was affirmed by the Supreme Court and then served as the template for a lot of struggles over usufructuary rights. But again, because of the arbitrarity of treaty law, this is also something that if it fits the government's interest, it will simply ignore. And that is the uplifting note that I have to end on today. Anyway, thank you for having me. If there's questions or discussion at this time, we can do that.
How many First Nations groups have agreed to the Line 3? Is there a mixture, or is it overwhelming groups that have said we don't want it? Or what's the story?
It is And again, it's one of those things where, like with any issue, you're not going to find everyone on the same side of it. But from the perspectives of the tribal governments, particularly the ones in the affected areas, it is pretty across the board negative. Oh, yes.
I'm curious about wild rice growing and harvesting in general in Minnesota, and then also maybe this aside about the leaf, sorry to get hurt and be affected. What specifically is that?
So the question about wild rice growing and harvesting in Minnesota, and also the leaks that have occurred were in the maintenance, in the process of creating a new line, which Enbridge continues to claim is not a new line, it's repairing an existing line. But it isn't, these are different lines. I don't remember where it was exactly, but it was, other than that it was into a lake, which in this state does not narrow it down even a little bit. But like all pipelines, leaks are inevitable, and smaller ones are just going to, there are going to be larger ones and there are going to be smaller ones. And the leak was particularly, the discussion about the leak was particularly interesting because it coincided with a discussion about Enbridge's outrageous water usage during the past drought that we had. You had a question about wild rice cultivation. Was there a more specific part of?
I'm just curious about how that isn't existing. Who's growing the rice and harvesting it and benefiting from it, and how that culture is doing it.
So there's two types of wild rice. There's commercially farmed and wild harvested. And the commercially farmed one is smaller and like a darker color, and it's significantly chewier. And the wild harvested one is a little bit like it's a lighter brown. It's fluffier, and you can grow commercially harvested wild rice more places. And often that gets grown in like more agriculture. It's still not exactly an agricultural setting because you still have to grow it in a lake. But it is a more agricultural setting, and you can do that in more places. Particularly, I think there's the wild rice harvest range starts about here and goes up. Most lakes preserved to some degree, and like most lakes that are not developed will have some degree of wild rice harvesting. There's particularly large wild rice beds in White Earth, which is here. Nope, that's Leech Lake. White Earth, Red Lake, Leech Lake. A lot of the reservations set aside intentional land for the cultivation of wild harvest wild rice. So, if that makes sense. Mm. Yeah, similar to the fishing process, there is you can apply for a license, and there's a limit to the amount you can harvest.
I feel like we're pretty far away from anything that looks like reparations. Where is that debate?
Where is the reparations debate these days? Not very far along at all.
Canada seems to have done some of that.
Yeah, it's interesting comparing the cases of Canada and the US because, for lack of a better term, Canada is newer, and they have a higher percentage of First Nations people, and also process of grappling with Canada's mistreatment of Indigenous people has happened a lot differently because of its relation to the Crown and other mistreatment of people in colonies across the former British Empire. So I guess now the Commonwealth. And Canada also, in my view at least, seems to feel significantly more guilt about this, so is more motivated to do things, but is also, much like the US, motivated to do things that are largely optics-based. Things like Indigenous Peoples Day is great. It's good to have that. It doesn't do anything. There's no tangible practice behind it, particularly if it's still kept as Columbus Day. So the discussion around reparations in the US look stunted at best, in part because of the wide spatial and also chronological variety in where colonization occurred. A reparations debate in New England looks like people saying, no, there aren't any Indians here, we killed them all 400 years ago. A reparations debate in Alaska looks like, no, it's still ours. And a reparations debate in Hawaii looks like the US overthrew a sovereign country in 1898. So there's not, it's in a lot of different places, in a lot of different places. Yeah, the debate is in a lot of different places, in a lot of different areas, and particularly with how it intersects with the debate around reparations for the descendants of enslaved people. In Canada, it's slightly more straightforward because they didn't have chattel slavery to the same degree. And it also, I think, it's different in a Canadian context because in Canada, the motivations for incorporating Indigenous people into the Commonwealth looked, for a long time, a lot more like extractive colonialism than settler colonialism. So there was more an emphasis on military and higher level administrative control than using settlers to replace Indigenous people. It also helps that Canada is bigger. So I think there are a lot of interesting comparisons to be drawn, and I think Canada is certainly ahead of the US in these sorts of debates, but I think much like single-payer healthcare, there will be an interesting discussion about how to apply things that exist in a Canadian context into things that exist in an American context. Yes, treaty abrogation is interesting because it, like you say, if the treaties are abrogated, the land still belongs to Indigenous people, but that will come up in a context of, the people will counter that with, well, but they're not there. You can have legal right to a thing, and if you don't physically control the thing, or physically occupy the thing, or if someone else just has it, your rights, while existing in legal standing, are effectively meaningless. I'm sure you'll be familiar if you've ever loaned a neighbor some tools, and then you wait to get those back, because they're your tools, but you're never getting those back. And I think the most interesting thing with legal discussion of treaties that has come up recently is the McGirt v. Oklahoma decision, which, in a manner of speaking, ruled that a number of reservations in Oklahoma were not, in fact, dissolved. But the Oklahoma government is, in a similar case to line 3, proceeding as if that did not happen. Because that's the thing about, well, all law, but Indian law being subjective is, it is what you make of it. If you pretend it doesn't exist and you operate as if it doesn't exist, then it still effectively does not exist.
On my limited visiting in Canada, I was always so impressed that they always used First Nation as their term. Maybe I didn't need to be so impressed because it was maybe part of the deal.
I think the use of First Nation as a term is, and as a standardized term, is certainly better than a lot of the terms that have gotten used in the US. I think at this point, it is so tied to a Canadian context that it would not work to apply it in a US context, similar to the word Aboriginal has become so tied to an Australian Indigenous context that it wouldn't really work to apply outside of that because it's so associated with that particular context. Also, it is a better term, but it is still just a term. If the Canadian government's ignoring the rights of First Nations people is effectively the same as the US government ignoring the rights of Indigenous people or American Indian people. It's a better term, but the term isn't really going to fix, the term itself isn't really going to fix anything.
To that point, you said earlier about great to have Indigenous Peoples Day, but if there are no actions associated with it, it's performative. And I remember asking you in Kitchen about land acknowledgements and the exercise that you said you do about acknowledging the land. Would you walk us through that quickly, what we sometimes do?
Oh, sure. Can I get a volunteer who has a wallet? A wallet. Okay. May I borrow your wallet? May I borrow your wallet? Did they give the land back? Okay. So, now I go, it works. I go, I sit down. I go, I acknowledge that this is your wallet. And then I go through the wallet and I start like counting the money, and it works better if there's a table. And I go, I acknowledge that I am not the original owner of this wallet. You are the original owner of this wallet, and I respect that you are the original owner of this wallet. And then you continue going through, and someone asks about reparations. You go, oh, no, because see, I'm holding the wallet, so I can't just give it back like that. It doesn't work like that. There's a whole legal system in place. I can't just give the wallet back. I'm using it. And then, right when the person is about the breaking point, you give them back their wallet.
He didn't reach his breaking point.
So that's obviously a hastened version, and you were in on the joke. But I like that one because it gets at, you can say all these things, but if there's not material actions to back them up, yeah.
So I have that thought, especially when you told me about how busy you were last week.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing multiple sessions. You gifted us with these sessions. If I were to ask you, Jennings, what would you like to see a group like this community take for a specific action to address what you're presenting? What would you say to us? And if it's not a fair question, that's fine.
Yeah, I would, and someone actually asked this question when I gave the presentation to the youth group. And my answer then was, I've given my time and ability to give you this information, to help you understand this information. I can't then tell you what to do with it, or anticipate the mistakes that you will make with the information when you try to implement it in your life. There's a lot of discussion in marginalized communities about not having the duty to educate And I know that I have the ability and I have a platform to educate, so I choose to do things like this. I choose to have discussions like this. But the best way to take action and incorporate what you have learned and what you have taken into your lives is to go out and do that with the knowledge that you will make mistakes about it, but that my limit is presenting the information. There are certainly other people who are far better able to talk about how to put this into practice, how to write your legislator, how to make this into policy, how to use what you have learned to incorporate this knowledge into how you live your life. But that is beyond my capability at this session. I will briefly say I can send it to you, Pastor Daniel. There is a program that there was one started in Seattle a couple years ago. There's now one for the Dakota, which is effectively a voluntary rent program where you, as a settler, can choose to give when one would pay rent a monthly donation to a Dakota nonprofit to establish a Dakota land base. In Seattle, the program is called Real Rent. I don't remember what it's called here, but I can find that and send it. But yeah, there are groups like that who have very, very concrete and very tangible solutions, and with how to implement this knowledge into how you go through your lives. But for here and now, I'm not going to do that.
But I would welcome you sending that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions before we finish? No? Well, thank Jennings. Thank you so much for your presence. And your choice to do this with us. I respect everything you just shared with us about this. I did find some information that I shared with Mary that the ELCA is currently doing in terms of advocacy, and I'll just pull that up quickly. So there is actually a piece of legislation that ELCA Advocacy is asking us to support. So if you see there, it's a Truth and Healing Commission, and it is about what Jennings presented to us more specifically last session, and there is a bill that is up to make amends moving forward. It says the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies in the United States Act would establish a commission to investigate past injustices of the federal government's cultural genocide and assimilation practices through its Indian boarding school policy. So we have this link. Actually, I got it from Sue Everson after she was inspired by Jennings' last session. So we will send it to you this week, and we ask that you sign. It's one of those fantastic interfaces where you literally just put some information in, and that it will automatically send it to your representatives, no matter where you're living, and you can personalize the message. And after years of doing faith-rooted advocacy on my end with various issues, I know that the legislators get this information. They keep track of it. If you're a constituent and they get a message from you, and they get a lot of them, they pay attention to these things, so it can help. So I think we should take Jennings' presentation at face value in terms of him challenging us to find out what is our response going to be. And I also love that you said, we're going to make mistakes in this, but it doesn't mean we're not called to make some specific moves to address these things. One last thing. In Luke 11, a woman comes to Jesus and cries out and says, "Blessed is the woman who bore you," right? And the womb that nurtured you. And does anyone remember what Jesus says in response? Blessed rather are those that hear the word of God and do it, right? In that case here, you have almost another performative action where this woman cried, bless you, you know? Jesus says, hey, it's not just, I don't want your praise if it's not tied into hearing the word of God and doing it. And I think that's the challenge that Jennings has also left us with. So again, thank you, Jennings. Let's give one more round of applause for all of your time with us. Thank you. And have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Thank you for attending these sessions. We will see you, not next week, but 2 weeks, because next week is Confirmation Sunday, and a lot of us won't be here because the families and friends of those confirmands will be here. So we will see you on November 7th, right, Mary? And Mary and Carolina will actually be going through a review session. We'll be talking about the RIC sessions and Jennings sessions to talk about how we might apply this in our Christian discipleship.